אני עובר לאנגלית, ואני מתכבד להציג את דוקטור דיוויד גררייבורד, Associate Professor of Judaic Studies, a historian of early modern Jews. Dr. Gurreybord's research focuses on the Western Sephardi diaspora of the 17th century. In particular, Dr. Gurreybord's writing approaches questions of religious, social, and political identity, as these questions shape the lives of so-called new Christians or conversos from the Iberian Peninsula, who became Jews in exile. He has also written about Judeophobia in the culture of the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions, marginality and dissidence in Jewish and Ibero-Catholic societies of the 17th century, ethnicity and religion among Sephardim from medieval times to the 1700s, and converso trading networks in the Atlantic. More recently, he has begun to research Jewish ethnic identity and Zionism among American Jews. And his title is Early Modern Judeo-Portuguese Nationality Views from the Study of Modernity. Dr. Please.
Toda Rabba. It's very nice to be here in honor of Moshe Moses. I'm particularly pleased that you have been wished, that's an awkward phrase, that people have wished you many future years, because otherwise one might think that we are at your wake. We are not about to bury you, no worries. Now for something very different. Historical scholarship knows many kinds of nations. By far the most famous kind of nation belongs to the modern period. Now typically historians define modern nations as social groups that coalesce or have coalesced around three features: a shared culture, number one, a connection to a common homeland, number two, and a specific form of political expression, what is typically known as nationalism. The study of modern nations has long been intertwined with the study of the emergence and consolidation of nation-states in the 18th and 19th centuries. In other words, historians have tended to see nationality and nationalism themselves as phenomena that were largely caused by the scientific revolution and by industrialization. There are scholars, however, who trace the origin of nations and nationalism to much earlier periods. Not surprisingly, these are people who, they include social scientists, historians, and so forth, people who have paid close attention to Jewish history, people like Stephen Grosby, Azagat, David Goldblatt, even Anthony Smith. Many of these scholars see the ancient Israelites, among other groups, as a people who were defined by allegedly modern phenomena of national self-perception, of nationalism, of nation-statehood. Now, my impression, right or wrong, is that early modernists, people like me who busy ourselves with the 4 centuries between the Middle Ages and the French Revolution, have tended to lie somewhere outside of theoretical debates between the modernists and the pre-modernists about nationality, about nationhood, about nationalism. But this is not to say that early modernists simply don't know about any nations. In fact, quite the contrary. We know very well of distinct consortia of sailors, shipbuilders, customs officials, accountants, and especially traveling merchants and their families. They were called nations. For example, the Basque trading nation, the Armenian trading nation, and of course the Judeo-Portuguese Nação. These consortia were organized usually as networks of commercial houses located in key port cities or in depot towns. In those places, the trading nations enjoyed juridical recognition as self-governing corporate entities, and as such, they were in charge of their members' welfare, both spiritual welfare and material welfare. For purposes of this brief presentation, I wonder where the early modern Judeo-Portuguese Nação fits within the larger history of nations and nationalism, especially among the quintessentially modern variants of national phenomena. I suspect that if we had ample time, let's say months, To explore this question, we would probably begin to see whether it's possible to use Portuguese, the Portuguese of the nation, as they call themselves, to fill some of the early modern gaps in the larger genealogies of nationality and nationalism. At any rate, this conference makes it appropriate, I think, to explore a rather narrower question. Where does the Nação fit within the larger multi-millennial history of Jewish nationality, if indeed it fits there at all? To begin the exploration of this query, I think it's useful to recall Anthony Smith's definition of national identity as it emerged in modern times, mostly in modern times. In Smith's view, all nations develop and exhibit 5 characteristics or features to one degree or another. Number 1, a historic territory or homeland. Number 2, common myths and a common historical memory. Number 3, a common mass public culture. Number 4, common rights and duties for all the nation's members, for all the nationals. Number 5, a common economy and territorial mobility for the members. Now, so there are 5 features. Does the Nação, or did the Nação, display these features? Let me deal with the first feature, question of the national territory or homeland. The fact is that, like all early modern trading nations, the Nação was at base an association that possessed an ethnic character. And as Smith and his colleague John Hutchinson explained to us, an ethnic community is always marked by its members' connection to a specific homeland, among other factors. As we know, the homeland of the Nação, at least the imputed homeland of the Nação, was Portugal. Already, René Levine Melamed has gone over some of the difficulties in classifying and defining the identity of this nation, but I'm going to simplify it. So we have Portugal as one potential focus for the Nação, one territorial focus. However, the members' relationship to Portugal was very fraught for reasons that are already obvious given Dov Stuczynski's presentation. Many of the members were certainly proud of their Lusitanian culture. At the same time, they also felt the sting of their collective status as a persecuted minority. This was a minority to which the so-called old Christians, Cristãos Velhos or Cristianos Viejos, typically imputed a kind of inborn, indelible Jewishness, and therefore a propensity for socio-political and economic subversion, for religious treason, for immorality, and so forth. Indeed, we may say that the new Christians were designated as the Jews, quote unquote, the pariah Jews of the 16th and 17th century in Iberian lands. This was a place, of course, where there were virtually no unconverted, openly professing Jews since 1498. To make matters concerning this notional homeland more complex, some of the members of the Nação became Judaicized in what their intellectuals called the lands of freedom, in places like Hamburg, Bayonne, London, Amsterdam, Dutch Brazil, etc. In other words, in those places where Jewish culture was either not banned or where it was banned, but in effect it was tolerated. This Judaicization of some of the members of the Nação implied that the emigrants turned, at least in their imagination, they turned to a homeland other than Portugal, other than Spain, namely the land of Israel. Now, I'm not suggesting, of course, that many of the nationals actually underwent aliyah, but at least we know that Eretz Israel was one of the main focal points of the Jewish re-education of these nationals. It was certainly that this land was certainly a focus of the messianic expectations. For example, in the case of those Judeo-Conversos who supported Shabtai Tzvi. So, to summarize, the Nação really did not embrace a single, unambiguous homeland, and therefore the Nação had no clear national geographic attachment. Now, what about the second criterion? Common myths and a common historical memory. Now, this particular aspect was salient for several early modern nations, not only because of their ethnic character. After all ethnic groups have to have some kind of story about who they are and why they are who they are, but also because these associations, these human associations, served explicitly religious functions for their members. So, for example, when our honored colleague Moshe Orfali explored the nomologia of Emmanuel Aboab from 1629, Orfali was really delving into the formation of a national mythology. Granted, Aboab's work was a polemical defense of rabbinic tradition, but I would argue that at least indirectly, the nomologia was a defensive celebration, indeed a justification of the ethnogenesis of the group. A group that had at least officially decided to align itself with the very Judaism that its Iberian assailants loved to hate. People like Costa Matos. In that sense, the nomologia was one in a very large collection of works through which the new Christian expatriates, in essence, crafted narratives of collective redemption for themselves. These narratives served to explain themselves to each other, and pointedly to explain to Christians as well, why the so-called men of the nation, hommes de nation, had become new Jews, Judeos Novos, or Judíos Nuevos, as they sometimes call themselves. In particular, these works presented rabbinic law as the formal and allegedly inevitable basis of the nation's newly adopted Jewish identity. Now, some of you may know that in my own work, I make the case that religion, or for example, an attraction to rabbinic law, had far less to do with the coalescence of the new Jews as a diasporic community than the ethnicity of new Christians, as well as the economic position and behavior of the new Christians within the larger world of early modern mercantilism. But that's another story, okay? For now, what I want to emphasize is this. In order to configure itself and lend itself an aura of transcendent antiquity, of theological correctness, the Judeo-Portuguese nation wrote itself into a historical chain of tradition. This morning we heard about the Shalshelet HaKabbalah of the Ibn Yahya family. Well, this is one such chain of tradition. That chain served to link the nation to a larger Israelite saga, to the Torah, to God at Sinai, and of course to link the nation to God at Sinai through several rabbinic works. Let's not, of course, forget the so-called martyrs of the nation. I'm speaking of the handful of celebrated individuals, many of them old Christians, by the way, who died at the stake in Spain and Portugal, defiantly declaiming their love of the Ley de Moisés, right? The law of Moses. They too served a kind of prophylactic function. Specifically, they made new Jews of the Western Sephardi diaspora into heroes of Jewish history writ large. So that's on one hand, right? We have that heroic narrative, that heroic Jewish or Judaicizing narrative. On the other hand, we all know, or we ought to know, that the members of the nation, in reality, did not share a common collective mythology or self-image. This is because the nation included many genuine Christians, as well as many earnest new Jews, as well as people who vacillated between the two camps, and who moved between the two camps. In other words, cultural unity for the nation was merely notional. That unity was not real with a capital R. For the men and women of the nation, ties of familial kinship, ties of business, and patterns of sociability cut straight across political boundaries, religious boundaries, geographic boundaries. No matter what their learned and pious leaders in the lands of freedom preached, the men and women of the nation displayed a far weaker devotion to Judaism, and by the way, this is a non-Jewish concept, Judaism, and they had a far more comfortable relationship with Christianity than I think traditional Jewish memory has tended to acknowledge. So to summarize, the Judeo-Portuguese Nação did not possess a single unambiguous homeland. It also had no common mythology and memory, except perhaps for memories of the experience of having been victimized at the hands of the Iberian Inquisitions, victimized by the ideology of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, victimized by popular sort of street-level anti-Jewish hostility. And of course, as you know, people like Bento de Spinoza argued, persecution does have a very strong bonding effect for those who experience persecution, for the persecuted. Now, what about the other three factors of modern nationality according to Smith? Did the Nação exhibit these factors? A common mass culture, shared rights and duties for the members, and a common economy and mobility within that economy. Well, as I've already intimated, both in Portugal and in the diaspora, the diaspora of the New Christians, they operated as an organized, self-governing consortium. But here too we see a crucial bifurcation. What do I mean? Judeoconversos in the Iberian lands behaved and were often recognized as a professional and ethnic corporation. For instance, they counted with a very sophisticated cohort of lobbyists who promoted the members' interests vis-a-vis, let's say, the Habsburg crown, the papacy, and so forth. These representatives, if we want to call them that, pooled enormous sums of money to bribe various officials on behalf of the Nação. The leaders of the Nação even presented themselves in public ceremonies as official representatives of a distinct social entity. In fact, as some of you here have argued or already know, these leaders wanted to convey that collectively the Nação represented a very important asset for the Portuguese crown and for the Spanish crown. And that, by the way, is exactly how officials such as the Conde Duque de Olivares regarded them. However, it's far from clear that these political and public relations arrangements that obtained in the Iberian Peninsula had much to do with the political and institutional lives of the new Jews of the diaspora. After all, new Jews counted with a separate, decidedly Jewish communal boards, with synagogues, with yeshivot, with rules of ritual behavior, with ideological controls, and the gamut of social services that tend to accompany the formation and the operation of halachically configured kehilot kedoshot. So perhaps the only true network that articulated the Nação in effect, despite its social and cultural divisions, or perhaps because of those social and cultural divisions, was economic and familial, I should say. In other words, kinship and commerce were the true structural bases of the Nação. Now, none of this that I've gone over is surprising to many of you, but I address it here to issue the following proposition. The Nação was a product of its marginality, much more so than enduring nations are a product or are products of theirs. The role and position of the Nação in relation to Jewish nationality in general was transitional, therefore, and highly contingent. That is to say, that new Christians and new Jews were little more than culturally liminal subjects. They were culturally marginal as well, and they had to be highly flexible in a cultural sense. What I've seen throughout my readings of their history is that they were eventually pulled apart by the vortices, by the forces of more powerful national formations. These nations, the Christian, the Jewish, were endowed with an unambiguously treasured national territory, be it Spain, Portugal, be it Israel, whatever, and with, this is the punchline, they were also endowed with genuine cultural sovereignty. Unlike unambiguous early modern Jews who were steeped in their traditions and who counted with a sophisticated cultural system of sanctification that they had practiced continuously for thousands of years, the members of the Nação had no staying power in and of themselves. They had no independent culture, I would say, at least not one that went beyond the memory of having once been Iberian, or of being Iberian, and at the same time being rejected by other Iberians, being stigmatized by other Iberians. Mind you, I'm not suggesting that any culture is completely sovereign or completely independent, yet I would hazard that there are those cultures that ultimately withstand their embeddedness in one or another more powerful culture, and indeed retain their distinctiveness despite a position of subalternity. The rhetoric of the Nação was often brilliant, it was sophisticated, but I read it as essentially defensive and apologetic. It was, to be sure, a very creative rhetoric, but mostly to the extent that it injected Christian and Western motifs and genres into Jewish discourse, and vice versa, injected Jewish motifs and genres into, let's say, European discourse. Now, normally when we tell the story of the Anusim of the Western Sephardi diaspora, I use the scare quotes because I don't like the term Anusim, we end up talking about people who were really engaged, really committed in one way or another to Jewish culture, either in favor or against. People like, Aboab, right? Emmanuel Aboab, Menashe ben Israel, Isaac Cardoso, and of course the renegades like Uriel da Costa and so forth. What we sometimes miss by focusing on these figures is the full depth, the true depth of the new Christians and the new Jews' dependence on the Iberian cultures that rejected them. A far more paradigmatic figure of the Nação, I think, is the author Antonio Enriquez Gomez. He was a man who took refuge in a Judeo-Portuguese community in France when the Inquisition was about to arrest him in Castile. Not surprisingly, Enriquez Gomez is known for his very acidic, very erudite attacks on the culture of the Holy Office and on the fanatical, aggressive Catholicism that underlay the Holy Office. But I think it's very telling that Enriquez Gomez, to my knowledge, never wrote anything in favor of Judaism per se. At least not something that focused on Judaism, right? It's also very telling that Enriquez Gomez returned to Spain, where he, became the partner of an old Christian woman and published in Spanish under a pseudonym. So when we consider the place of new Christians and new Jews in the history of nationality and nationalism, we may well view them partly as precursors of modern phenomena. Specifically, these men and women help us to identify or isolate a few of the elements that may indeed lay the groundwork for lasting nations. What are those elements? Well, economy, kinship, mobility. But we can also see that for Enriquez Gomez and the Nação, these elements really did not exist in quite the right combination with other factors. These factors didn't acquire the fixity, the independence that is necessary for ultimate national resilience. That is why, by the 18th century, I would say, once the global markets had shifted, the Nação largely assimilated into broader Sephardi formations, into the broader Sephardi diaspora, and we can't forget this either. The nationals also assimilated into Christian communities, something that not many of us have studied. Nations, like the Jewish people, may devise very intelligent schemes for maintaining themselves in exile and anchoring themselves in a notional homeland. In the case of the Jews, we have the so-called portable homeland of the canon, Tanakh, Talmud, Torah Shebe'al Peh, etc. But until modern times, that canon presented a very capacious and sufficiently compelling mythos of Jewish particularity, of ethnicity. Until the 19th century, many generations of Jews taught and internalized that mythology as a uniquely positive basis of collectivity. Jewish identity was not largely dependent on being a victim, on feeling aggrieved, on feeling alienated, on being the hated other. But even what resilient nations like the Jews cannot do, unless they cultivate the will to fight for it, is establish their political and territorial sovereignty. When the conditions of diaspora overtake the strategies of national survival, a nation can scarcely develop the web of propitious conditions that will sustain it. New Christians and new Jews never had such sovereignty. That is why they resonate in Jewish national memory much like the 10 lost tribes of Israel. That is, they resonate as a heroic, almost fairy tale cohort, because we really know that, in reality, they will never come back. Thank you.